number is completely off the wall. They don't count people who stop looking for work. So, that's kind of the problem with where we are now is the the data and the information and the pricing has been manipulated with computers since the 1970s. That's a long time to manipulate something and keep it artificial. And that's kind of one of the things I'm looking at these days is there are people within our government who want prices to get back to normal, but they know that it'll take a shock because all the data is wrong, and they have to kind of adjust their way of thinking just to put numbers out now. So yeah, it's not true. It's not real. I think the economy is going in a dumper, and the jobs number is just another joke they're playing on the people.
Why do you think they're manipulating the numbers so much?
Well, they have to. I mean, you go back to 1971 when we went off the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
In history, every time a country goes off the gold standard, it usually lasts maximum of 6 or 7 years before the whole thing implodes. But this time was a little different because you had the introduction of computer trading and computer market manipulation back in the mid 70s. And that has controlled prices for so long. It has allowed this unbacked fiat money system to go unnaturally long. I mean, it's been over 45 years.
Yeah.
That's crazy in like the monetary history for something like that to happen. But the only way it was done is a complete lockdown and control of prices and data coming out of the government and into all the markets. And I proved this market manipulation computer angle. That's what ROOTA means. ROOTA
Right.
is ROOTA, means root A, and it's the basis of the financial monetary system, the basis of electronic assets that were invented in the 60s. It's crazy, but it's real. And people are starting to see the market manipulation, but they're just, I mean, nobody stands up and says, let's look where these volumes come from. The full float of a stock trades within 5 days when 90% of the people never sell their shares. That's just in their 401k. Where do these shares come from? Are they real or are they electronic blips, and are they ever settled? Questions like that people will start asking once this next crash happens.
We know they manipulate all the statistical numbers like GDP, inflation, unemployment, and we can see it. It's plain as day, like you said. What about gold and silver? Now, a lot of people still believe that gold and silver, they're not manipulated at all. They believe, these are the everyday prices. And I just had David Morgan on the spotlight, and we were talking about the US debtclock.org website. And at the bottom right-hand corner, they had the gold price measured in the M2 money supply, and they had gold at like 7,331 and silver at like 800.
Yeah.
Going back to the 1913 calculation. So for those people out there, are they still manipulating gold at this point, or is this the real price of gold that we're seeing out in the marketplace?
Well, that debtclock.org is not a government published site.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of looks official.
Yeah.
But it's a formula. They plug it into, as the M2 changes, it'll change all the numbers on their clock. I love it. It's hysterical to look at, but in reality, the prices of gold and silver have been rigged on computer programs since the 1970s. Before that, it was rigged in the London gold pool, and before that, it was illegal to own gold in the United States before the mid 70s. I mean, all this, when people like Bernanke come into Congress and Ron Paul asks him, is gold money, and he says no, it's just there for historical reasons. That's complete bullshit. It is a complete lie, and they lie through their teeth. It is gold and silver are the number one assets that the Fed has to control because they are the best barometers of what's going on with fiat money. And if they don't, just look, what would a 10,000 ounce gold price do to the confidence in the U.S. dollar? It'd be all over the news that, Yellen and Bernanke and Greenspan are destroying the dollar. Yes, they are. They are. And that has always been the plan. Run this system as long and hard as you can, soaking up all the benefits until it doesn't benefit you anymore, and then crash the system by printing too much of it.
So,
and that's exactly what they're doing right now.
Do you think the manipulation at this point is coming to an end? Because back in December we saw gold, it was like 1050, and then we've seen it spike up, and we've seen it suppressed once again, but it's much higher than it was in December, and it looks like it's trying to move up.
Well, you're looking at a market that is 99% controlled by a handful of people run out of the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Fed. I mean, these trades aren't real that go on. Over 500 billion electronic ounces of silver trade every year. That's ridiculous, that number. And it goes throughout all markets. I mean, I was looking at they were talking about the Saudis talking about selling their U.S. Treasury holdings, and they're saying, oh, it'll crash the market because they have 700 billion U.S. Treasuries. Where do they think that'll crash the market? $5 trillion in FX exchanges happen every single day. I mean, this is a derivative game. It's got nothing to do with the physical part or even the root of these derivatives. Like, yes, U.S. Treasuries is a derivative on something else, but at least it's not an electronic swap or forward or future that's traded 100 or 1,000 times what the underlying physical asset is. This is the problem with looking at prices. Like, we can be excited that silver went from $15 to $17 to $18, but it's got nothing to do with the physical stuff. It wasn't caused by people buying silver or selling silver. It was caused by how many derivatives that the Fed New York and the bullion banks that are run by the Fed New York, when they trade their exchange stabilization funds, and that's what it's all done, and it's out of the U.S. Treasury. So there is no real value for anything these days because there's no free and open, honest exchanges.
When do you think this will then break where they're no longer controlling this? I mean, when people are looking at gold and silver, they see, whatever today's price is, it's at 12 and change. When do they say, oh, okay, look, it's up to 15, maybe something's happening, maybe it's up to 18, something's happening? When does the control lost and people start looking at it saying, okay, I better do something?
When they shut down the exchanges, because there is no physical exchange for gold or silver. They can say the LBMA is physical, but with over 100 billion ounces supposedly transferred every year on that exchange in silver, that's not a real exchange. There is no real exchanges for gold and silver. So when will it end the manipulation? When the COMEX, the LBMA, and the Shanghai Bullion Exchange, when all those shut down, then we're going to get close to a real market, because we're going to have to start up again. When the derivative bubble crashes, which I believe will be at some point this summer, probably instigated by Deutsche Bank, whose stock is plummeting and they're the largest bank derivative holder in the world. I mean, why isn't this a gigantic red flag for every single news commentator in the world? They have 50 to 75 trillion in derivatives, and they're throwing out $8-10 billion losses every quarter or every year. That's the problem. And when the derivatives go, derivatives are all that stuff that's traded on the COMEX, all the stuff that's traded on the LBMA, all the stuff that's traded on the Wall Street stock exchanges. All that, it's a complete phony game. And when that starts to break apart, Warren Buffett called it derivatives a weapon of mass financial destruction. And he's absolutely right. It would destroy every bank, which would destroy every company in the United States and every human being. We all were conned into keeping our assets, as they call them, in electronic blips at a bank who takes those assets, leverages them up 10, 15 to 1, and makes risky bets with them so they can make more money, write themselves a bonus, and then walk off at the end of the day and get bailed out.
You mentioned the derivative crash. What signs are you looking at to see, that this is starting? Because you mentioned this summer, which is right around the corner here. You mentioned Deutsche Bank. What are you looking at to recognize that this is on its way?
I'd say more and more problems. Deutsche Bank announced that they're paying 5% on short-term money on CDs. I mean, the only bank that would do that when they have 0% interest rates or negative interest rates in parts of the EU, the only bank who would do that is a bank who could not borrow from the central bank or other banks at a cheaper rate than 5%. And that is just crazy to think that, because, they should be able to borrow. They're still rated, I think, either single A or triple B. They should be able to borrow at, almost nothing like all the other banks, and then leverage that, 5 or 10 to 1, and then have money to play with like they always have. But now they can't. So they have to put these crazy interest rates out there that they're going to have to pay or might not pay, because you got to keep it with Deutsche Bank for 90 days. And 90 days puts us right into the kind of the heart of the mess I see coming at the end of the U.S. fiscal year, which is in the end of September. So it's all kind of boiling around that point that Deutsche Bank is begging for money just for 90 days. And anybody who gives their money to Deutsche Bank at 5% is crazy, because they'll never see that money again.
When this derivative crash comes, is there any way that the Fed will be able to contain it, where they'll say, "Oh, don't worry, it's not going to hit the U.S., it's contained in Europe"?
Well, I don't think they want to contain it anymore. I don't think it's in the U.S. best interest to keep this game going, because clearly Asia's taking over and Russia's taking over. They're even going around the SWIFT system. China built this new system that they don't even need SWIFT. Now, SWIFT is absolutely the reason that the U.S. has been the economic powerhouse, because they can cut off the money supply to any country because they control the SWIFT system. And the SWIFT system it allows banks and central banks to transfer money from one another. And, if you control that, you can cut off anybody. I mean, everybody's like, well, Venezuela is dying economically. Its currency is dying. The U.S., this currency is destroyed by the U.S. traders. I mean, the U.S. controls every currency with a computer program in the basement of the U.S. Treasury. When the U.S. says, "Oh, I feel for these countries," we don't feel for them. We're putting them there. We're putting them in these problems. We are destroying their currencies, or we can, if they do what we want them to do, yeah, we'll let them up, because we can change the value of their currency with a click of a mouse at the basement of the Treasury. It's complete insanity right now. And more people are figuring this out, and smart people in like China and Russia are using it to their advantage. They know that the U.S. has a gigantic weakness. Putin at any point can stand up and say, "Hey, we're going to buy $10 worth of silver and destroy the whole game in a blink of an eye." And that's how vulnerable we are right now, because of the system we've created.
So you're saying that they're just going to let the whole system just go at this point?
Well, I think they've clearly removed some of the more obvious market riggers like HBSC and Bernie Madoff. That thing was, I mean, why didn't J.P. Morgan go to jail? I mean, if you read there was a lawsuit against J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was the only banker of Bernie Madoff. And as a banker, you are responsible for knowing everything that your customer does with their money. How did Bernie Madoff pull out $50 billion and had no transactions of buying stock? I mean, and then JP Morgan gets, let off scot-free with a little fine. I mean, what is going on here that they can get away with that? And the shutdown of Bernie Madoff, that whole scam, was just another signal that times are changing, and a lot of these really bad, evil traders, bankers, banksters are kind of being shown that they got handcuffs on manipulation. But I do think it's still being managed by the U.S. Fed and the U.S. Treasury, because they can't let it go. It's been cooped up for so long, and the prices are so distorted, they can't let it go until they're ready for the big let go, the big kind of release of the manipulation, which will crash all systems. I think that's planning, I think it's planned for August, September, from the good guys, I call them, at the Treasury and the Fed. I mean, you can look at the $100 bill, all the gold on that bill, and it talks about overthrowing your government, and say, oh my God, maybe there is, someone within the Fed and within the Treasury that's looking out for us. But I do think that's their plan. And then the bad guy banksters, the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and those guys, they're shooting for a later collapse near the near the election to cause the most chaos, and then just let the system fail for a couple of years, and then they'll come back and say, you guys have destroyed yourself. Let us help you again, like they did, in 1913.
Well, if they let the system just crash, and I'm talking about the good guys, bad guys. If the system crashes, won't the people here? Because the president he's been telling us that we've been in a recovery. The Fed has been telling us we're in a recovery. And if the system crashes, aren't the people going to say, well, wait a minute. You're telling us unemployment's at 4.7%. You're telling us that everything is fantastic. And if you don't believe me, you're peddling fiction, that we've been in recovery since 2008, and then the system crashes. Aren't the people throughout the world going to go, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? Aren't they going to point the fingers at the U.S. government, at the Fed, at the central bankers?
How will they relay that message? I mean, if the system crashes and the banks do go down, and this is what Hank Paulson stopped, you're not going to have communications. I mean, the system crashing means everything is done completely. And it's all about how can you reboot the system? Because, you're not going to be getting food to people. You're not going to be getting information out there. The system can't run without money. Money is the blood of the system. And if the system crashes, which means every single bank, they're all connected to each other, goes down, what do? It's a frightening thought. And the U.S. has had plans for this transition for a long time. People usually turn to their government. And I think that's where the U.S. is headed now. And we're trying to replace our current government with some people who know what's going to happen and will look out for the good of the people. But, unless you have a system already in place, you can kiss it all goodbye. And many, many, many people will die.
You're saying when this crash comes, you're saying like everything is going to come to a screeching halt. There'll be no communications with your cell phone.
Well, remember, behind all these technologies, right, there's a credit, and that credit relies on their money in the bank. Mm-hmm. So will the power companies keep running if they don't have any money? Will the internet providers keep running if they can't pay for power and they don't even have any power? See, it's a bigger problem than just worried about, the Fed lied to us and the government lied to us. There'll be time for that after something is put in place that the people can survive this. Otherwise, we'll have millions of people dying in the streets of America. And, the scariest thought is that guns and bullets don't need power and don't need infrastructure. And so, I mean, I do expect to see riots, at least sporadically, unless the U.S. government gets someone in power who says and announces it before these banks crash that we're about to make a changeover. You've been lied to all these years. Here's why we had to lie to you. Here's why we had to keep the system going. We didn't want all these people dying. We're going to have martial law for a little bit, but don't worry. It's not an evil thing. We just need to keep things in place until we start again and start fresh. And we are going to prosecute all the criminals this time in Congress, in the banking system. Everywhere you find a criminal, it's a come to Jesus moment, and we're going to prosecute you. Otherwise, you get what the bad guys want, a complete shutdown of the system, absolute Mad Max world for a couple of years, and then they come back in and say, all right, we'll take care of you, but you're going to have to believe in a one world government and one world currency and things like that. And then we're going to take away all your rights because it was your rights that really destroyed your country. So yeah, we're inching into that very scary time. And, if they do try to just keep it going as they have been, by rigging the stock market and rigging the gold and silver markets, it'll just get worse and worse and worse. And they've been putting it off for so long because it was going to be so bad. And now there's no way around it. You got to crash the whole system and start fresh.
How long do you think it will be that the system is down? Is it like a month, 2 months?
Well, I'm working on my fourth book right now, and it has a lot to do with the crash and how it will go down. And yeah, some places it might be, months, years, decades. Some places will adapt. I really see kind of small communities starting to recover before the nation as a whole. I think our federal government will be demolished and changed drastically. Actually improved to go back to what was supposed to be very small, very little power outside of what is afforded to it in the Constitution. But that still leaves. Yeah, you got to remember also that when the monetary system crashes, yes, it will be horrific, but it'll solve a gigantic problem, which is debt. There will be no debt after the monetary system crashes. Yes, there will be no electronic assets either, but the debt will be gone. And I think the debt is a larger problem for humanity right now than the losing their electronic assets.
So there'll be no electronic assets. What do you think will be the currency of choice after the crash?
Well, I have a chapter on this in the book. Truthfully, I think it'll be, well, first of all, we're not going to trust any government or bank to tell us what is going to be used as the next currency. So in the United States, we'll probably go back to gold and silver in some form. I know there's a lot of gold the U.S. has been hiding for this moment and coining at the U.S. Mint, and they're ready to go with like millions of gold coins, literally. But there's also it'll come down to individual communities, and there'll be a lot of barter, but because cryptocurrencies might do well if the electronic system stays intact and the internet gets back up and running. I mean, it's kind of a good idea when you dig into the cryptocurrencies. It'll be one of the choices, and people can use anything they want. Some people will use the U.S. Federal Reserve note still. They'll probably be very valuable because people recognize them as currency, and there won't be any other than the paper bills out there. So all of a sudden, yeah, your electronic money is gone, but your paper money that you have in your pocket and your coins that you have in your coin jar will still be there, and they'll be a lot more valuable than they were the day before.
If we're going to have this crash, like you're saying, coming up this August, and currency is
now,
going to be...
as far as the exact date, nobody's going to get this right, because I don't even think the Fed and the Treasury know when they're going to lift this kind of manipulation thing they got going on. So I'm thinking it's August, September. If it goes into October, November, we're in deep trouble, because that's kind of the bad guys' time frame.
So let's say the second half of this year.
Yeah, a little bit. What happens between now and July 1st?
Yeah. What's very interesting, a lot of people are out there saying the same thing you are, where they're looking at the second half of this year saying, yes, from what we see, this is definitely coming. Actually, Deutsche Bank came out with something where they were discussing when, of course, they're saying just a recession is going to begin, and they're saying it's going to be in this fall. Which
isn't it funny, because they're giving out 5% interest rate for and you can't cash it in for 90 days.
Right. That's very interesting. Why then do we have all this talk if the whole system is imploding, where the Fed is out there talking about raising interest rates? We have negative interest rates out in Europe and Japan. Why do we have all of this? Why don't they just crash everything?
Well, it's the same reason the Fed and Congress have been saying the same thing since the 1970s. We got to get the budgets in order. We got to get capital spending in order. We got to take care of entitlements. And the gold report back in the early 1980s that Reagan Commission came out with the conclusion that, well, we're not going to go out on a gold standard yet, but over time, unless budgets and money printing gets under control, we're going to have to go back to gold. So what did they do after 1981, 1982? They just spit money like it's going out of style. They want to crash the system. We want to go back to a gold standard.
Now, you mentioned that the Mint has gold ready on hand, ready to create these gold coins. How much gold do you think they have? Well,
there's two kinds of things going on here. One is the Mint is preparing and has been preparing since 1987, the beginning of the American Eagle coinage bill. They have been instructed by our government to one, print the American Eagles gold and silver and sell this to the public, but also keep some for the transition over back to a gold standard. And the big gigantic gold mines that have been found in the Grand Canyon is the big one that I discovered. It was a front page of the New York Times, and they said we're going to be pulling billions of ounces out of there, meaning it's remember back in the early 1900s, the article was from like 1912 interesting that it's right before they allowed the Fed to take over, which I have a theory on that too. But a gigantic gold mine, and it's still. I know a guy who went there or tried to go there, and he was detained by it was the U.S. Marines that are in the Grand Canyon blocking this
Really?
area off. Yeah, and you can't go there anymore. They actually caved in part of the kind of the little river tributary that went in there, so you can't get to it anymore other than through their methods. But if you look at the Grand Canyon, about large portions are completely blocked off, and no human beings other than the military are allowed to go in there. That's just supposed to have. That's going to be the largest one. Then there's another secret gold find in Chocolate Mountain at the Chocolate Mountain Gunnery Range. You notice all these secret gold mines are hidden in like national parks or military ranges and things like that. But that was Dianne Feinstein who brought people there in the 90s, senators and really high ups, the Fed chairman, and Greenspan's been in there. Supposedly just a gigantic gold reserve in there. And that's what Feinstein's land grab is all about, the Desert Wildlife Preserve. Millions of acres have been basically stuck into this Desert Wildlife Preserve to, save the chameleon, the two-horned chameleon type of thing. Same is going on in Alaska and all that, the Anwar and all that. There's so much oil up there that we've been saving for a rainy day. Lindsey Williams talks a lot about that, and that's what we do. We print electronic money, and we use everybody else's natural resources because we know at the end of the day, the electronic money is going to go away, and you'll be stuck with, okay, no one will be trading with you, so you can use your own natural resources from then on out. And that's been our plan since the 1920s and 30s. In the 1930s, we shipped all our large mining equipment to Russia. It was crazy, and it destroyed the mining industry. But Russia became this huge resource powerhouse, and we used a lot of their resources. So the game goes on, but there is a plan to change it, and we're starting to see it now. There's all kinds of talk of stopping the manipulation, ending the game of the bankers, and we'll see what happens this summer.
Let me just ask you this. What happens when this starts to fall apart in the second half of this year? The people that have their savings in bank accounts, in checking account, in their savings, their retirement, what happens to those funds?
Well, what funds are we talking about? If you put money into a 401k or Schwab account or something like that, they don't actually go buy the stock and put it in your name and settle. They debit your account, and then they take that cash and they use it for other things. So the big con on the stock market, for example, is that it's 10 or 20 to 1. 10 or 20 times the amount of shares that are supposed to be out there are traded. Never settled. The DTCC, the OCC, the Office of Comptroller of Currency, and the SEC are saying that over 300 million shares are never settled every single day. I mean, it's complete fraud. And you can see it with the high traders trading, tens of thousands of shares per millisecond. Well, are any of those shares ever settled? No, none of them. As long as the music keeps playing, these phantom shares go back and forth. And same with, you put your money in a bank, the bank takes that money and leverages it, 10, 15, 20 to 1 and lends it out in their high frequency betting scams. So, it's just like It's a Wonderful Life. If you think you have your money in the bank, you don't. You really don't. The bank doesn't have your money. They go out and gamble with it. And yeah, if you're a one-off guy and you say, oh, I got to get out of the banking system, you can go in there today and, if you want cash, it usually takes them a couple weeks to get enough cash to hand you. But, if you get more than 10% of the people walking into a bank to say, I don't feel comfortable with this bank, I want my money out, they don't have it. And it would destroy the bank instantly.
You talked about the bad collapse, like if something happens like in October or November or later in this year. What is this bad collapse from the central bankers? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's two kind of things running parallel right now. both sides of this equation, both sides, the good guys, as I call them, the people working to, get us back to a constitutional form of government, and the bad guys, the banksters and the Rockefellers who are trying to take over the world, they both want it to collapse. The question is, what's going to happen after the collapse? Are we going to run to the bad guys for protection and help? And, oh my God, we don't have this, this, and this. Or are the good guys going to come in and say, okay, we have a plan. We've been expecting this for a long time. We're going to go back to our Constitution if you guys want, because everybody's going to have to agree on something. And that's going to be the really hard part. I've been talking a lot about the current presidential election. What would be best for the country is if the Trump people and the Sanders people got together and said, screw these Democratic Party and Republican parties. Let's get together these two sides of America, because our country was built on the opposite ends of the spectrum. Even our founding fathers didn't agree on much at all, but they agreed that the country was more important than individual perspectives, because the country allows you to be yourself. We're a republic, and it allows the individual to be free. And without it, if we're gonna be divisive with the Democrats and the Republicans, then we're screwed, and we won't end up with the kind of government and way of life that is enjoyed today. A lot of people think it's very repressive now. Well, just wait till the bad guys crash the system and remove the money, and then we go to them for help, and they say, well, you gotta give up all your rights and freedoms, and we're gonna scan you, and we're gonna make you use our form of money, which will be electronic, and we can cut you off at any minute. And why don't we just put a mark on your forehead, 666 up there, just to identify